On a worn-out street corner in Atlanta, a frail young girl played her violin not for applause, not for fame, but because she was fighting for her life. Leukemia had stolen her strength, and every note she played was a battle, every dollar in her violin case a step closer to the treatment she couldn't afford. Most people walked by, indifferent, never sparing her a second glance, but one man stopped. A billionaire, a visionary, and true to the nature of a man who believed in talent, he didn't just listen, he changed everything. The streets of Atlanta hummed with life as the late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling sidewalks. Cars honked in the distance, blending into the rhythmic beats of street musicians strumming their guitars, while vendors called out to passers-by, their voices swallowed by the ever-present hum of the city. Among the chaos, near the entrance of a busy square, a girl sat alone on a weathered wooden stool, a violin resting against her shoulder. Her fingers trembled slightly as they found their place on the strings, the bow poised in her other hand. She took a slow, steady breath, then pulled the bow across the strings, and the first note rang out. Soft, clear, filled with something unspoken yet powerful. Celeste Walker was 19 years old, but today she felt much older. Maybe it was the exhaustion pressing down on her bones, the weight of too many sleepless nights spent worrying, or maybe it was the harsh reality that had forced her to grow up faster than most girls her age. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for sure. This violin, this music, was all she had left to fight with. She wasn't here for charity. She wasn't here for pity. She was here to earn her place, to carve out a future in a world that had already tried to strip everything away from her. Her mother, Lorraine Walker, stood a few feet away, pretending to admire a store window while keeping a protective eye on her daughter. Lorraine was a woman who had never known how to quit. A single mother, she had raised Celeste with nothing but sheer willpower and long hours working as a hotel cleaner during the day and a restaurant server at night. When the diagnosis had come, it had knocked the air out of her lungs, but she had not broken. She had fought hard, running from one organization to another, filling out endless forms, standing in long lines, begging for help from charities that were already stretched thin. But money didn't come easily, and time was running out. Celeste knew all of this. She saw the way her mother's hands shook when she thought no one was watching, the way her shoulders sagged under invisible burdens. And that was why Celeste refused to sit at home waiting for a miracle. If no one was going to save her, she would save herself. The first few notes of her violin wove through the air, floating above the noise of the city, delicate yet unwavering. Some people turned their heads, momentarily drawn in by the unexpected beauty of it. A couple holding hands slowed their steps, listening for a moment before walking on. A young mother pushing a stroller glanced toward Celeste, offering a small nod of appreciation. But she didn't stop. Most people didn't. They were too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice a girl with a violin playing her heart out on the sidewalk. Then, the first coin clattered into the open violin case at her feet. A little girl in pigtails grinned up at Celeste as she tugged on her father's sleeve. "She's really good, Daddy," she whispered excitedly. The man chuckled and fished out a dollar bill, dropping it into the case before leading his daughter away. Celeste smiled, but it was fleeting. A moment later, a group of teenagers sauntered past. One of them, a boy in a hoodie with wireless earbuds shoved into his ears, snorted as he nudged his friend. "She thinks she's Lindsay Sterling or something," he muttered, just loud enough for Celeste to hear. Another man, middle-aged with a neatly pressed suit, barely spared her a glance before shaking his head. "Street musicians," he muttered under his breath, almost as if the word itself disgusted him. Celeste didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that some people only saw what they wanted to see. They saw a girl begging on the street, not a musician trying to survive. They saw desperation, not determination. But she wasn't playing for them, she was playing for herself. The sun inched lower, and the warmth of the afternoon gave way to the cool embrace of evening. Hours passed. The violin case in front of her was no fuller than it had been when she'd started. A few crumpled bills, some loose change. Not enough. Never enough. Her mother approached as the last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the pavement. "Celeste," she murmured, voice gentle but firm. "That's enough for today." Celeste hesitated, her fingers tightening around the neck of her violin. She had so much more to give, so much more music left inside her, but the ache in her back, the throbbing in her hands, and the sheer exhaustion dragging at her limbs told her she had already pushed herself too far. With a reluctant sigh, she lowered the violin from her shoulder and carefully placed it in its worn, velvet-lined case. As she packed up, she caught the glance of a woman in her 40s dressed in a tailored navy blazer. The woman had been watching her for the past 5 minutes, lips pressed together in thought. Celeste's heart lifted. Maybe this was the moment. Maybe she would ask about lessons, about a performance, about anything that could lead to something more. But the woman only sighed, shaking her head. "Oh, honey," she murmured, voice thick with sympathy. "I wish I could help, but times are tough for all of us." Celeste forced a polite smile. "Thank you for stopping," she said, even though she wanted to scream. The woman lingered for a second, then walked away, blending back into the flow of the city. Brave. That was the word people always used when they talked about Celeste. Brave for fighting, brave for not giving up, brave for facing something no teenager should ever have to face. But Celeste didn't feel brave. She felt tired. She felt afraid. As the city lights flickered on and the crowds thinned, Celeste slung her violin case over her shoulder and turned to her mother. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing down on her. "I'll play again tomorrow." Lorraine sighed, looking as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Celeste's shoulder. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. Celeste nodded, though deep down she wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. The two of them walked home in silence, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Celeste clutched the violin case tighter, as if somehow, some way, it held the answer to everything. She didn't know that somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking the skyline, someone had just read her story, and soon everything was about to change. The next morning, Celeste woke up to the familiar ache in her bones, a deep, relentless exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. She stared at the ceiling, the faint cracks in the plaster forming patterns she had traced 100 times before. The house was silent except for the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Her mother, already up, already moving, already fighting. Celeste sat up slowly, wincing at the dull pain in her joints. She had pushed herself too hard yesterday, but she didn't have the luxury of resting. The hospital bills wouldn't pay themselves. Neither would the next round of chemotherapy. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, Lorraine Walker was hunched over the table, a stack of papers spread out before her. Bills, applications, denial letters, the same paperwork that had haunted their lives for the past year. Lorraine looked up, her eyes weary but still filled with that unbreakable determination. "Morning, baby," she said softly. She tried to smile, but Celeste could see the worry etched into the lines of her face. Celeste grabbed an apple from the counter, taking a small bite before sitting across from her mother. "Any luck?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Lorraine exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Another rejection. They said the fund is out of resources for the quarter. I called 3 other places, left messages. I'll keep trying." Celeste nodded, swallowing down the lump rising in her throat. She hated this, hated seeing her mother beg for help, hated the way the system treated people like them, people who worked hard, who never asked for more than what they needed, who were still told, time and time again, that they weren't eligible. "I'm going back out today," Celeste said, setting her apple down. Lorraine's gaze snapped up. "Celeste, I don't know if that's—" "I'm fine," Celeste interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. "I need to do something. I can't just sit here." Her mother studied her for a long moment, then sighed, reaching across the table to squeeze Celeste's hand. "All right," she said quietly, "but promise me you'll come home if you start feeling sick." Celeste forced a small smile. The air was thick with humidity when she stepped outside, the morning sun already promising a sweltering afternoon. She made her way back to her usual spot, weaving through the city's heartbeat, vendors setting up their stalls, office workers clutching coffee cups, tourists moving in slow clusters, taking in the historic charm of it. When she arrived at her corner, she took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and then lifted the violin to her shoulder. The familiar weight of it, the way the wood fit perfectly against her chin, was the only thing that still felt right in a world that had been turned upside down. The first note drifted into the air, and the world around her blurred. She played not for the crowd, not for sympathy, but because music was the only thing that made her feel alive. It was the only thing she could still control. The reactions were the same as the day before. Some people stopped to listen, some ignored her completely. A few dropped bills into the violin case, though not enough to make a real difference. A businessman in a gray suit barely glanced at her as he passed, too busy with whatever urgent matters occupied his mind. A woman in yoga pants and designer sunglasses paused for a moment, nodded in quiet approval, but didn't reach for her wallet. Then there were those who didn't even bother to hide their dismissiveness. A man scoffed as he walked by, muttering something about another street performer clogging up the sidewalk. Celeste played through it all. She played through the judgment, through the exhaustion creeping into her limbs, through the sharp pang of hunger gnawing at her stomach. She played until sweat dampened the back of her neck, until her fingers ached from the pressure of the strings. And then something changed. A shadow fell across her violin case, and she felt someone standing close. Not just passing by, not just pausing for a fleeting moment, but truly stopping. She glanced up mid-note, her bow hesitating for a fraction of a second before resuming. A woman stood before her, holding a leather-bound notebook, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked young, mid to late 20s, her sharp eyes scanning Celeste with an intensity that made her stomach twist. The woman smiled slightly. "You're incredible," she said, her voice carrying easily over the noise of the street. Celeste lowered her violin, blinking at her. Compliments weren't rare, but there was something about this woman's tone, genuine, almost analytical, that made her pause. "Thanks," she said cautiously. The woman tucked her notebook under her arm. "I'm Jasmine Lopez. I'm a journalist." Celeste's heart skipped. "Okay? I run a small music blog," Jasmine continued. "I write about undiscovered talent. I try to find people who have something real, something that people need to hear." Celeste tightened her grip on her violin. "And you think that's me?" Jasmine smiled, but there was no pity in her eyes, only curiosity. "I think your music tells a story, and I want to know what it is." Celeste hesitated, glancing down at her violin case, at the crumpled bills that barely added up to $20. She wasn't sure if she had the energy to relive her struggles out loud, to put her pain into words for a stranger. But then she thought of her mother, of the way she had spent the morning fighting for a miracle that wasn't coming. And maybe, just maybe, this was another way to fight. So, she took a breath, and she told Jasmine everything. She talked about the hospital visits, about the sterile rooms and the beeping machines and the exhaustion that never truly left her. She talked about how the bills had drained them dry, how her mother had done everything humanly possible to keep their heads above water. She talked about why she played because it was the only thing she had left, because it was the only way she knew how to fight. Jasmine listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as she jotted notes in the corner of her notebook. When Celeste finished, the journalist was silent for a long moment, tapping her pen against the leather binding. Then, finally, she said, "People should hear this." Celeste exhaled. "You really think anyone would care?" Jasmine's smile was small but certain. "I know they will." Celeste didn't have the luxury of believing in miracles, but when she watched Jasmine walk away, already typing furiously into her phone, something flickered inside her. A sliver of hope. She didn't know it yet, but across the city, in a towering penthouse overlooking Atlanta, a man named Darius Caldwell was about to stumble upon that hope in the form of an article. And when he did, everything was about to change. The air inside the penthouse was still. The only sound the faint hum of jazz drifting from the state-of-the-art speakers mounted along the walls. Darius Caldwell sat behind an expansive mahogany desk. fingers idly tapping against the polished surface as he scrolled through his tablet. His days were often consumed by meetings, investment deals, and high-stakes negotiations, but every now and then he allowed himself a moment of indulgence. Reading about music, the one thing that had never felt like a business transaction to him. Tonight, he had been scrolling mindlessly through articles about up-and-coming jazz musicians when something caught his eye. The headline was simple, yet it carried weight. The violinist fighting for her life and playing for it too. Darius frowned slightly, curiosity piqued. He tapped the article, and as his sharp eyes scanned the words, his fingers stilled against the desk. The story unraveled in short, impactful paragraphs, painting a picture of a young woman named Celeste Walker, a violinist who played on the streets of Atlanta not for fame, not for spare change, but to survive. The journalist, Jasmine Lopez, had captured every detail: the exhaustion in the girl's frame as she played, the judgment she faced from passers-by, the resilience in her music, and most painfully, the mother fighting against a system that had already decided their fate. By the time he reached the last sentence, Darius was no longer just intrigued, he was invested. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched before him, lights blinking like distant stars, a sea of wealth and struggle existing side by side. He knew what it was like to fight against odds. Born into poverty in Southside Chicago, he had clawed his way to the top, not with luck but with sheer force of will. He had once been a kid with nothing but ambition and a head full of ideas, and now he was one of the most powerful black entrepreneurs in America, the founder of Caldwell Technologies, a billionaire who had built an empire from nothing. And yet, despite all his wealth, all his success, there was something about this girl's story that cut through the noise. Maybe it was because he had always believed in music, believed in its power to transform, to heal, to fight. Maybe it was because he saw a reflection of himself in her determination. Or maybe it was simply because he knew what it felt like to be invisible to the world. Until someone decided you were worth seeing. He pressed a button on his desk. A second later, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell?" "Find out everything you can about Celeste Walker," Darius said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Where she plays, what time she's usually there, what kind of music she plays. I want details." A slight hesitation. "Would you like me to arrange a private meeting?" "No." Darius glanced at the article one last time before closing his tablet. "I want to hear her play for myself." The next afternoon, Celeste returned to her usual spot, the violin case slung over her shoulder, the heat pressing down on her like a weight. The day had already been long. Another hospital visit, another reminder that time was slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. Her mother had begged her to rest. "Baby, you can't push yourself like this." But Celeste had simply kissed her mother's cheek, slung her violin over her shoulder, and walked out the door. She set up in the same place she always did, just outside a busy plaza in downtown Atlanta, where the foot traffic was constant but fleeting, where people listened just long enough to appreciate her music before moving on with their lives. She didn't expect today to be any different, and at first it wasn't. The music flowed through her, the bow gliding over the strings with a precision she had perfected through years of discipline. A few people stopped to listen, some dropped coins into her case, others barely noticed. But then something changed. A presence. Celeste felt it before she saw it, the distinct sensation of being watched. Not the casual glance of a passing stranger, not the pitiful gaze of someone who felt sorry for her, but something sharper, heavier, like a force waiting in silence. She kept playing, but her eyes flickered across the crowd, scanning faces, searching for the source. And then she saw him. He stood a few feet away, dressed in a crisp dark suit, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He didn't have the air of a typical businessman. There was something more grounded about him, something familiar yet unknowable. His deep brown skin contrasted against the pale blue dress shirt beneath his blazer, and though he wore sunglasses, she could feel his gaze locked onto her. He didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't seem to be in a hurry like the rest of the crowd. He was listening. Truly listening. Celeste swallowed, her fingers tightening around the neck of her violin as she pushed forward, letting the music swell, letting it consume the air between them. If this man was here to judge, she would give him something worth judging. When she finished the piece, she let the last note linger, waiting for it to dissolve into the hum of the city. She lowered her violin, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, and finally looked directly at him. For a moment he simply stood there, hands in his pockets. Then, with a small nod, he stepped forward. "That," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate, "was extraordinary." Celeste's heart pounded. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, a polite compliment maybe, or another dismissive "you should be playing somewhere better." But his tone held something different. She cleared her throat. "Thanks," she said cautiously. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I read about you." Her stomach dropped. "The article." She exhaled slowly, bracing herself. She had already received messages from strangers, some encouraging, some invasive, some just plain condescending. People loved a good struggle story, but they never truly understood what it was like to live it. "If you're here to," she started, but he held up a hand, cutting her off with a simple, effortless gesture. "I'm not here to give you pity," he said. "I'm here because I wanted to hear you play." Celeste blinked. He pulled off his sunglasses then, tucking them into the pocket of his blazer, and finally she saw his eyes. Dark, piercing, unreadable. And then the realization hit her. She knew who he was. Darius Caldwell. Not just a businessman, not just another wealthy benefactor. A billionaire, a tech mogul, a man whose name was synonymous with success. A man who didn't just listen to music, he invested in it. A beat of silence passed between them. Celeste's throat felt dry. Darius Caldwell tilted his head slightly, as if assessing something she couldn't quite grasp. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "You shouldn't be playing on the street," he said simply. "You should be on a stage." Celeste almost laughed, a bitter reflex. "Stages don't pay medical bills." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "No," he agreed, "but I do." And just like that, the world shifted beneath her feet. Celeste's breath caught in her throat. She stared at Darius Caldwell, her mind scrambling to catch up with what he had just said. The words hung in the air between them, weighty, unreal. "But I do." Her fingers tightened around the neck of her violin, the wood warm against her palm, grounding her in a reality that suddenly felt tilted, shifting beneath her feet. People like him didn't make offers like that to people like her. Not without conditions, not without an agenda. She swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the violin case at her feet, at the crumpled bills and scattered coins that barely amounted to $20. Then he looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I mean," he said finally, "I don't believe in talent going to waste." Celeste forced a breath through her nose. Her whole life she had learned to be wary of promises that sounded too good, of people who claimed they wanted to help but ended up walking away when things got too complicated. She had been told she was talented before. That wasn't new. But talent didn't put food on the table. Talent didn't stop medical bills from piling up. "Look," she said carefully, "if this is some kind of publicity thing or—" "It's not," Darius interrupted, his voice even, calm. "I don't need publicity. And I don't hand out charity." Celeste clenched her jaw. "Then what do you call this?" Darius exhaled, tilting his head slightly as if considering how best to explain himself. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulling out a sleek black business card. He extended it toward her, but Celeste didn't move to take it. "This," he said, "is an investment." She hesitated, eyes darting between him and the card in his hand. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. "What kind of investment?" she asked warily. Darius's lips quirked at the edge, the ghost of a smile that never fully formed. "The kind that gets you off this sidewalk and into a place where people actually listen." Celeste's stomach tightened. She wanted to believe him, but belief had never served her well before. "I don't take handouts," she said, her voice quieter now but firm. Darius studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then gave a slow nod. "Good," he said simply, "because I don't give them." For the first time since he had stepped forward, Celeste felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not just curiosity, not just skepticism, something dangerously close to hope. Finally, cautiously, she reached out and took the card. The weight of it in her hand was heavier than she expected, the letters embossed in silver. Darius Caldwell. Caldwell Technologies. Beneath that a number. A direct line. She traced the ridges of the card with her thumb, then looked up at him again. "What exactly are you offering me?" Darius tucked his hands into his pockets, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. "A choice," he said. Celine's throat tightened. "A choice?" she echoed. Darius nodded. "You can keep playing out here, keep scraping by, hoping people see you. Or," he gestured slightly, not at the city, but at something beyond it, something bigger. "You can come with me. Let me give you a stage. Let me give you the resources you need, not just for your music, but for your life." Celeste's pulse pounded in her ears. It was too much, too fast, too impossible. She shook her head slightly, not in refusal, but in sheer disbelief. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darius' expression didn't change. "Because someone once gave me a chance," he said simply, "and I don't believe in letting potential die on the street." Silence stretched between them. A car horn blared somewhere in the distance. A woman with shopping bags hurried past, her heels clicking against the pavement. The world kept moving, unaware that in this moment Celeste's entire life was being rewritten. She glanced down at the business card in her hand, the ink stark against her skin. Then she looked back at Darius Caldwell, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to wonder. Just what if? Celeste sat at the small kitchen table, the business card still clutched between her fingers, its smooth surface warm from the heat of her palm. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of traffic outside, the distant wail of a siren echoing through the city. Across from her, her mother, Lorraine Walker, studied her with careful eyes, her hands resting on an unopened stack of bills. Bills they both knew they couldn't afford to pay. "He just offered?" Lorraine finally asked, her voice tinged with the same disbelief Celeste felt in her own chest. "No conditions? No strings attached?" Celeste exhaled slowly, running her thumb along the raised lettering of Darius Caldwell's name. "He called it an investment," she murmured. "Said he wanted to give me a choice." Lorraine leaned back, crossing her arms, her expression unreadable. "And do you trust him?" Celeste hesitated. She didn't know the answer to that, but she knew one thing. Darius Caldwell wasn't just another wealthy benefactor throwing money at a cause to make himself feel better. He had listened to her. He had seen her, not as a struggling girl on the street, not as a charity case, but as something more. And when he had told her she belonged on a stage, she had almost believed him. Almost. She placed the card on the table, smoothing it out with her fingertips. "I don't know if I trust him," she admitted. "But I think I want to." Lorraine sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Baby, I just don't want you getting your hopes up for something that—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I just don't want you hurt." Celeste swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I know." Silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. Then, finally, Lorraine reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Celeste's. "Then find out," she said softly. "See if he's real." The next morning, Celeste dialed the number on the card, pressing the phone tightly to her ear as it rang once, twice, 3 times before a smooth, deep voice answered. "Darius Caldwell." Celeste inhaled sharply. "It's Celeste," she said, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. I want to talk." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, as if he had been expecting the call but still gave it his full attention. "Then let's talk," he said simply. 2 days later, Celeste found herself stepping through the gleaming glass doors of Caldwell Technologies, the vast lobby stretching around her in sleek lines and modern elegance. The receptionist had barely lifted a phone before she was being ushered upstairs, the elevator rising so smoothly she barely felt it move. When the doors opened, Darius was already waiting. He was dressed differently today. No blazer, just a simple button-down with the sleeves rolled up, leaning against his desk as she entered. He gestured toward the leather chair across from him. "You look like you have questions," he said. Celeste sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had burned in her chest since the moment he had stepped into her world. Darius studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Because you remind me of myself," he said. "Because I know what it feels like to have a fire inside you and nowhere to put it. And because I have the resources to help, but I won't waste them on someone who won't fight for themselves." Celeste's throat tightened. "And what do you expect in return?" Darius tilted his head slightly. "That you don't waste this." She exhaled shakily. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she nodded. "I won't." The next few months felt like stepping into a different life. Darius had been serious about his offer. He didn't just cover her medical bills. He made sure she had everything she needed: a private music tutor, access to a recording studio, and when she was strong enough, an audition with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's youth program. She spent hours in rehearsal rooms, her body exhausted but her soul alive in a way it hadn't been in months. She played until her fingers ached, until the music became something more than just survival. And Darius, he wasn't just some distant benefactor watching from the sidelines. He showed up. He sat in on rehearsals, arms crossed as he listened with the same intensity he had the day they met. He didn't coddle her. He didn't offer empty encouragement, but when she struggled, when doubt crept in, he reminded her why she was here. "Stop playing like you're asking permission," he told her one night after a rehearsal. "You don't owe this world an apology for being talented." Celeste had never had someone believe in her like that before. And then, one evening, as she prepared for her first real performance, Darius handed her something. A letter. She frowned, unfolding it carefully. It was from him. "Celeste's. I've spent my life building things. Companies, legacies, opportunities. But nothing I've built has ever mattered more than giving someone a chance. You didn't need saving, you never did. What you needed was for someone to see you, to hear you. Now the world will play your damn heart out. Darius." Celeste swallowed past the lump in her throat. Then, with trembling fingers, she folded the letter, tucked it into her violin case, and stepped onto the stage. 1 year later, the music hall was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation as Celeste stepped onto the stage, the spotlight catching the soft shimmer of her navy blue gown. She lifted her violin, the weight of it familiar, steady. Then she saw him. Darius Caldwell, sitting in the front row, arms crossed, a small, knowing smirk on his face. Celeste took a deep breath. And then she played. The first note rang out, filling the hall, filling the space between her past and her future. And as she played, she didn't think about the girl who had once sat on a street corner, playing for strangers who barely noticed her. She thought about the girl who had fought, the girl who had been hurt, the girl who had finally found her stage.